to Thrive While Loving an Addict. I'm KL Wells, and I just can't tell you how joyful I am to have one of my favorite people on today. This will be Jim Horton's third time on our podcast. I adore this man. He is just a bright light in the world of dealing with addiction, and I wanted to have him join us again. It's been, I don't know, a year and a half maybe or so since we talked last, and there's always an evolution to our journeys. And so I wanted our audience to have an opportunity to see where you are in your journey, Jim. And of course, not everybody's heard what your story is. So if you could give us the front end, and then before we got on camera, you were beginning to tell me the evolution of your unfolding. And I think that's just so helpful for our audience to hear that too. So again, welcome. I'm super excited to have you again. And you all are in for a treat.
Kale, thank you so much. And by the way, you're one of my favorite people too. So it's always great when I get a chance to meet someone who doesn't know who you are, and I get to refer them to your podcast, or I get to have them get in touch with you. I think just recently someone did. And to have people in your life that you can count on that is going to give great information.
Yes.
And you know, Kale, one of the things that I always say whenever I'm speaking to a group is that just because I say something doesn't mean that I'm right. What it means is that for me right now, it's very right for me.
Yeah.
And it also means that I probably know a little bit more about this than anybody else in my shoes because I've been living it full time for the last 5 years. So because I've read every book I can get my hands on, I've watched every film, I've read as many journal articles as I could find. You know, I've given myself pretty much a PhD in how terrible a life can feel like after losing someone.
Yeah.
Right. But something that you started with is like, and this is a space I find myself in now. 5.5 years ago, my space every week looked like playing golf 2 to 3 times a week, figuring out what retirement was going to be. My son had just graduated high school and he'd be going to college. What was it gonna look like to help him through college, help him maybe start a business, get married, have grandchildren, all of those things that we dream about as parents, right? And I often say that there's a time in your life before you have children, there's a time after you have children. And without exception, I don't know anyone who has children who still talks about their life before. Every decision that we make, everything we think about is focused around how do I make a better life? Even if I'm not successful at that, that's still in the back of my mind. And I'm still striving toward that. And tragically, I lost Zach in January of 2020, just 7 or 8 months after he had graduated high school. Man, my life was just turned upside down, you know. And that's what we had begun to talk about when you came on. I think we met shortly after my 1-year anniversary. Well, I believe that's when it was. The first year and a half that I would go out and share and speak to groups. And my goal at the beginning was to maybe talk, hey, we're going to start a foundation. We've got to do something. I don't want any parents to have to deal with this pain that I'm feeling. What can I do? And so I talked to my wife. We formed a 501c3 and she's a director at a children's hospital. And so I was just going to make it my life's mission to speak once a month, right? That was my goal. I was going to speak once a month to some groups. That would be great. Would be getting to hear my son's name. When you lose a child, people are often very fearful talking to you about it, about mentioning his name. And so in my mind, he is now all but forgotten, right? So I'm sure in the beginning, just me keeping his memory alive was important. It was certainly all about my grieving process. I would talk for a half an hour about how horrible it felt, and tears would flow and the audience would be upset. And they definitely felt my pain, right? And again, I hadn't quite figured out how to have that motivate the change that I wanted to see, but it was my start. Our mission in the foundation is to save lives by ending the stigma of addiction. So as year 2 came around and then year 3 came around, there was a shift that began to happen for me. And part of it was as my grieving process, and my wife and I, we co-facilitate grief groups, loss of child groups. And at that time, it was children that were lost for any reason. And there's a lot of things that we share in common, but there's certainly some things that when you lose a child from overdose, that there's only a few things that you have in common, but greater with that group. Well, and unfortunately, in our area, that is such a huge demand that we now run 12-week groups all year long that are entirely filled of families that have lost their children after overdose. So it's
Wow.
called the HALO group, Help After Loss from Overdose, is what our groups are called. That was certainly instrumental, I believe, in me moving forward. Not forward like it's behind me. Forward is that now I'm moving through it, right? Where at one
Mm-hmm.
point I was just at one end of it, and now I'm just kind of moving, I'm just moving through it. And believe me, it's always swimming upstream, right? But we're now moving through it. So that shift began to happen. And then it became more along the lines of, well, now when I speak, I have a, I tell a little 2 to 3 minute story about Zach that just encapsulates the beauty of who he is, right? And then I go straight from there really into discussing all of the data points, the awareness, the things that I missed as a family member, as a voyeur from the outside looking in on a society filled with addiction and filled with problems.
Yeah.
We don't see it all. We don't even come close to seeing it all. We see just a portion, or that portion that the media wants us to see, the portion that the video plays, or that the movie plays, or that the song sings about.
Yeah.
We don't see the pain. We don't feel the pain. We don't have the privilege to hear people say when false information is espoused over the
Hmm.
news
Hmm.
or over the TV and it's not challenged.
Yeah.
And no one says that's not it at all, right?
Right.
So now when I talk, I fill up that last 25 minutes all with that information. That's about that. And
Mhm.
my goal, okay, when I give a talk now, is if I can change someone's perspective, if they view addiction even that much, then it is a huge, huge win. And if it shifts even more, even better. Because I have this idea of what addiction is, what they
Mhm.
think about. If I can
Mhm.
get them to change it, and I got a couple examples, but please respond. I can see, and I know you get it. I know you get what I'm talking about.
Yes, absolutely. I've been in this journey for a long time, although my son's almost 2 years clean and sober at this point, which is just a miracle. So what I was struck with was, and I think about this a lot, is changing perspectives. And so, you get a half an hour to shift somebody's perspective from here to there.
Mhm.
What's the perspective that you most want to shift when you talk to groups?
Here's what a win looks like for me.
Great.
If I can challenge an audience that when they leave, regardless of what they think about what substance use disorder looks like, feels like, smells like, tastes like, whatever their idea is, if they're committed to going and having a conversation with one other person about
Hmm.
that, that's a win.
Yeah.
Because until we're willing to talk about it, it's still in the closet. And there's not going to be any changing whatsoever. And I use the analogy all the time. What came up through the 80s when I grew up was cancer. And I often say, Richard Nixon in 1970 declared the war on cancer and the war on drugs. Now, what ended up happening was we had a very effective campaign and war on cancer, and we had a less effective campaign and war on the drug user, most likely dark-skinned drug users in particular. But when I talk to groups, and again, when I talk to older groups, and one of my best groups was a Kiwanis group, the average age was probably 75. So I had some in their 60s and many in their 80s. So I had this group of like 20, 30 people.
Hmm.
And so I started sharing with them. And when I talked about breast cancer, I said, you guys remember back in the 70s and 80s, you couldn't even say the word breast on TV.
That's right.
It wasn't even allowed, right? And then in the 80s, as cancer research happened, there were big campaigns all over about doing self-exams. I remember going to a friend's house and taking a shower, walking in their shower, and there's a placard hanging on the shower, how to do a breast self-exam.
Hmm.
Now, every October, there are millions of people watching football and seeing every player run out with a pink ribbon on their shirt or having pink
Hmm.
socks. Everybody knows what it means. No one's afraid to talk about breast cancer. It is way out in the open. Does that mean that people still don't get breast cancer? No, of course, there's still people that are diagnosed with it thousands every year, but people don't have to die from it now. 70s, it was a coin flip. If you have breast cancer,
Right.
whether you would die or not, because you wouldn't tell your family, you wouldn't tell your friends, you might not even go to your doctor until it
Hmm.
was way too late. Well, now people are encouraged for that. That's the shift. So in my
Hmm.
mind, when I go into a
Hmm.
group, that's what I want to get people to that point.
Mm.
People don't look at someone who has cancer as being evil or contagious, right? Or bad.
Yeah.
They still view people who suffer from substance use disorder that way. I want to make that shift. KL, I spoke to this group of 20 of these older people. And then I always end my conversation with doing a Narcan training. Here's Narcan, here's how it's used. Without exception, every person that left that day took a box of Narcan, and they were all so excited about going and telling their adult children and how they could tell their grandchildren, their teenagers, of why they need to know how to use it, how they can save a life, how they can be a leader among their peers.
Right.
Now, sadly, that comes from my son's experience of the night that he overdosed having Narcan in his car. But his best friend that he was with and his friend's mother didn't recognize the signs of an overdose, or his friend didn't care. And he went on and died that night and didn't have to. Right? And so today, with fentanyl being present in almost every illegal drug, it's so important that Narcan's available and that everyone understands how to use it.
Yeah. I was thinking about the age group that you were talking to relative to Kiwanis, and what we experience in Eugene, Oregon is that a lot of elderly people that we've met along the way, they have lost a child or a grandchild. And it is more often than not the case, which is extraordinary. And we are still captive to the stigma of substance use disorder because there are behaviors that go with it when you're in addiction mode that are really tough to swallow for a lot of people. And they're not able to separate out the person who's under the influence of substances from the person who's still inside.
Yeah.
That is captive to the drugs that they're using.
KL, there's a topic that I've wanted to talk about for so long. And I think it fits in well here. And again, like I said before, just because I say something doesn't mean it's right. And I know you will feel free to disagree with me.
Yeah.
if you do. But to that point specifically, how do we as families, how would I as Zach's dad, because you know what I wanted from Zach when I found out that he was addicted to opiates? I wanted him to be sober. I wanted him to not ever use anything ever again. And I had been sold a bill of goods to me that was the mark of success.
Right.
Now, the position that I take now and that I encourage families and parents to do is to meet your loved one where they are. That's really the very definition of harm reduction. Make their life better. And to that point, I have been talking even to some of my friends in recovery. And again, I never want to be a stumbling block for them or make them think something else. But as I'm gathering information, to me, as I work in the recovery community, and especially now that I've branched out and I don't only work with people in rehabs, but in homeless shelters and in other areas of town, you know what? Not everyone has access to a 30, 60, or 90-day program.
Right. Very few do, percentage wise.
Very, very few do. And in fact, someone who's been a heroin addict for years, maybe what a win looks like for them is instead of shooting up 15 times a day, just shooting up twice a day. Maybe what a win is them having access to clean needles and not damaging the rest of their body and their life when they're ready to get completely clean by having Hep C or by having AIDS or by having something else that is going to perhaps ruin their life even more. Now, is the goal absolutely sobriety? I mean, that's what the goal was for my son. I've been happy if he were alive today smoking weed.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So the discussion that I want to start to have with people is, what's the difference in recovery and sobriety? Right? If sobriety has a date that I've never used anything since then, right? But recovery looks like, you know what? I made a decision that I want to change my life for the better, and I'm going to work toward that. Which one of those is more important? Now,
great question. Great question. Yes.
So now let me ask the pastor of an evangelical church. I mean, we want somebody to never sin again, right? But also the way that I remember reading the scriptures back when I was in ministry school was that God's grace is great enough for everybody and forever. And there's not a time limit or a number of times of transgression, right? The heart and how, and I think so. So for me, that's the way that I picture recovery now. In fact, I would say people enter recovery long before they stop using. And likewise, I think people who relapse and go back to a life of using, that relapse happens long before they ever take the drug. Decisions that they already make, right?
Right.
So in the recovery world, so here I am in the world where I'm giving talks and just talking about awareness. What does substance use disorder look like? How can we treat it? How can we talk about it? How can we engage our loved ones and our neighbors, right? Where it's not this stigmatized event. And then I have almost the same discussion with people in the recovery community.
Yeah.
How can you be kind to yourself and to the people that you're working with?
Mm.
Their journey doesn't have to look just like yours.
Exactly.
And now, Kale, you mentioned that your son now has a couple years, right? I've talked to parents whose children are 2, 5, 10 years clean, and they say to me, Jim, I still worry about the other shoe falling. I still worry about that call late at night that comes and tells me. And to me, that doesn't sound like they've moved into a place of recovery.
I would totally agree with you there. I mean, I still have it's almost like a PTSD thing. There's a thought that pops up. Is he okay? Something along those
Yeah,
lines.
yeah,
And then I have my recovery work to do with that thought
yeah.
because how much energy I choose to give it is my choice. And helping myself shift into being present in my life right now is my choice. So that's our recovery. That's our minute by minute, day by day recovery on the other side of the aisle. And it is work.
And I have to think that your son appreciates that you don't live and die by his every act. I mean, that takes a lot of pressure off of him because I know that's exactly the pressure I put on Zach.
Mm-hmm.
Every time he would have a slip, it's like, well, why can't you? I mean, I just can't believe the things that came out of my mouth during that time and how differently I would do it now.
Yeah. Well, I think my perspective at this point, having done this for quite a few years, is that really what it all boils down to is us loving ourselves in the midst of suffering, our loving ourselves in the midst of watching someone suffer, our loving them in the midst of their own suffering. We have to draw boundaries that allows us to love ourselves and gives us permission to love ourselves. But at the end of the day, we have no idea what somebody's journey is going to look like. And we act as if we do.
Wow. Well, the level of self-actualization that you're talking about, or just awareness of moving in that direction, I think it's so seldom for anyone to encounter that we don't even know that those are possibilities. The kind of work that I've done for myself in the last 5 years, I would have never done or thought of. I'd have continued living my life at the golf course, beer after the round, every Saturday and Sunday, right?
Yeah.
For the rest of my life. And been happy doing it, thinking I had arrived.
Right. Yes.
And so it's unfortunate that oftentimes tragedies, and mine I could argue is the greatest, but tragedy at any level is what oftentimes drives us to be willing to even understand what does it mean to love myself. I wasn't capable of loving my son just for who he was, or loving myself for who I was before.
Right.
I was living in such denial about so many things. And it doesn't mean that any of those things still aren't present now. At least I'm aware of them, and I choose not to deal with them, right? If I'm choosing, that's just too painful for me to deal with now.
Yeah.
That's an argument I'll have later. I'm not going to deal with it, but I know it's there.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the gifts inherent in this disease is that it cracks us wide open. And in that cracking is the opportunity for a great awakening to ourselves.
Yes.
And to each other. And so I'm willing to advance that notion that is possible.
Well, and to that point right there, I've heard a lot of people say this, and I've said it myself after going to 12-step meetings, with my son, for my son, learning about it. I remember saying, well, why do you have to be an addict or an alcoholic to be privy to this information?
Right.
Because it's wonderful information. Once you get past the whole God thing, if you have a challenge with that or the God of your understanding, all those other steps are just things that we do for a healthy lifestyle, right? How we give to others, how we make amends, how we want to be of service. All of those are just wonderful, wonderful things.
Right.
And another place I take issue with the recovery community, I often tell them, I do not think that any of the 12-step programs should be anonymous. Shame on them for keeping
Hmm.
that. There are
Hmm.
so many more people in recovery than
Yes.
we even imagine, right?
Hmm.
But we don't know about it. That's what continues to drive that stigma,
Yeah.
right? And like I tell some of my recovery friends, meth addicts that are losing their teeth, it's like, dude, you don't think everyone doesn't know you're a meth addict? You're living under a
Right.
bridge.
Right.
Hell,
Yeah.
you were drunk at every Christmas party that's ever happened and they had to carry you out. Everyone
Hmm.
knows you have a drinking problem.
Hmm. Hmm.
You
Yeah.
don't need to be anonymous. You need to get help. Let's everybody get the help we need.
Yes. Well, and I mean, I do think there is far more of a willingness to come out of the shadows relative to having the disease. There's more of a willingness to come out of the shadows having the disease than there is of us who love someone who's willing to come out of the shadows to tell our story, to say, look, there are so many more of us than there are of those who are dealing with the disease. We're just dealing with the disease of loving someone and thinking that we can change them, we can fix them, we can control them. And so I think I have far more people that come on this show that are in recovery from substance use disorder than recovery from loving someone.
Ah,
And because of that,
yeah,
because there is still that massive stigma. Why can't you control them? Why can't you make them go to rehab? Why? And so that is a complete and utter, I guess, lie about what of it. They just don't understand the disease.
yeah,
And then the kind of the flip side of that is when I'm actually talking to people that have dealt with the disease, like talking to Natasha and Haley, is okay, well, they love people that are suffering in the disease. So then they become the loved one.
yeah. And they don't have any example of what that looks like to do in a healthy way either.
I mean, generally, they're still steeped in their own
Yeah.
recovery from substance use disorder. When I was asking Haley her story, and that episode's going to drop tomorrow on April 22nd, she couldn't even begin to imagine with her kids if something happened with them. And I thought, isn't this just kind of mind bending in terms of being in the disease, witnessing the disease? I still think it just really comes down to us learning how to, as a humanity, love each other. Like truly love each other, like truly love ourselves for who we are, not who our parents thought we should be or who
Right.
society tells us we should be or anything along those lines, but loving ourselves for who we truly, truly are and loving those that we love truly for who they are.
Yeah.
So I know when I see the bright lights in people's eyes, and I can see it even in people who are dealing with the disease. They're still in addiction mode. I can still see that light. It may be just a little teeny flicker, but it's still there. So there's always hope. And I think as I've gotten older, because I'm approaching 70, I think of life a little differently now from the idea of it's almost like we're living this life to avoid dying, you know? So I think about a lot of that differently now.
Kale, something you said there about, really loving everyone for who they are,
Hmm.
right? Loving
Hmm.
ourselves, loving where they're at. I I think again, people who don't fully understand what that could look like,
Hmm.
especially for someone suffering with substance use disorder.
Hmm.
And for me, that doesn't mean that loving them doesn't mean that I may not set boundaries for them or
Absolutely.
or boundaries for me, right?
Hmm.
And loving them doesn't mean it has to be tough love either, where, but it could if that's what it feels like for me.
Hmm.
But I think just approaching it from, I mean, if I had been able to look at it, and I talk to parents whose kids are struggling so much, I can see the pain that they feel. And
Right.
you know this as a mother, and I know it as a father working with someone at the height of their addiction. I was so hijacked by every possible emotion
Yeah.
because I hadn't thought ahead and I didn't have a game plan of what love could look like in that situation.
Right. Yeah.
I wasn't going to find it then, right? That's not when I would find it.
Right.
And so I think leaning into what love looks like
Hmm.
if someone's listening to this now and watching it now, and you say,
Hmm.
I don't have any of these problems in my family, this is exactly when you need to learn how to love,
Hmm.
right? Do it
Hmm.
when it's easy,
Yeah.
because when it's tough, you ain't going to be able to find it
Right.
because you're in survival mode at that point, right? You're not loving or even hating, you're just surviving, right? And that's where I was. So I've been able now, just saying those words, gives myself a little grace and a little permission and a little love to look back at the failures that I had during Zach's at the height of
Hmm.
his addiction, right? When I didn't
Hmm.
know how to show love or I was doing it incorrectly. Now, did I do the best I could? Absolutely,
Yes.
I did. Had I heard us have this conversation 2 years before then, I may have made some extra steps. And it could have been
Yeah.
that's
And that's why we do these conversations. I mean, you and I are both on a path and calling of service out of having dealt with this disease in maybe different formats and different ways, but we've created a path of service out of this. And that's why we've connected at this really strong, heartfelt, authentic, genuine place. It's why I adore you and we have such a great connection. And it's out of that service that your journey has evolved and continued to morph and shift, just like mine has. And so I do want you to speak a little bit to the Women's Treatment Center that you all are embarking on.
sure. So now it's a women's sober living home. So it's not, yeah, so we're not
Great.
licensed and don't have that kind of staff or that kind of funds or
Oh,
ability. But in the last year, again, I talked about our foundation is now, it's finished up its fourth complete year. And so as we move into the fifth year now of the foundation, last year, Kale, we had the wonderful opportunity. We participated in or conducted 52 different events last year.
wow.
And an event would be something like the Kiwanis gathering that I
Yeah.
spoke at, or it could have been a 2-day street fair that 150,000 people came through, right? 52 events, trained over 1,700 people in the use of Narcan.
Wow. That's fantastic. Congratulations.
8 different people that I've ran into or have called me back talked about overdose reversals. That after our training, they had the Narcan that they were able to perform. At least 8 lives saved. 71 people coming out of treatment, we were able to scholarship into sober living.
Hmm.
And it was on the basis of that, hearing some of the stories of some of the people that we were able to help give that first month of sober living to. And sober living, for people who don't know, is where when people oftentimes will come out of treatment, so instead of them after only 2 weeks or 30 days, going
Hmm.
right back to the same environment that they
Hmm.
were in, that really possibly birthed their addiction,
Hmm.
we want to give them to be able to live in a different environment, to make new
Hmm.
connections, to
Hmm.
develop new habits, right? So
Yeah.
that they'll be able to live a life of recovery.
Hmm.
What we found was that there were a lot of homes where people would go into the homes and then they would have to leave because they needed to make the beds available for other people that were going into other full-time outpatient programs or hospitalizations.
Yeah.
And 4 months just wasn't enough.
Mm-mm.
They just weren't ready, right?
Hmm.
And imagine
Hmm.
somebody that's been on the streets for years and years,
Yeah.
young person that's been addicted for years and years, they just haven't had
Hmm.
that ability, right?
Right.
To make the kind of connections they want.
Hmm.
So our goal became, and we saw the greatest need because again, we scholarship so many people. We gift every month to 21 different sober living homes a care package to give. So everyone gets a little treat, a little taste of home, a little bit of love. They'll know that they're still loved, right? So
Yeah.
that's every month. So after working with all these places, we also realized that there were only a couple women's homes. And we know
Hmm.
that women struggle with addiction in the same numbers that men do. Oftentimes they don't get the same help, right?
Hmm.
Seen differently. It's still there. So we embarked on a women's sober living home. So we leased a house and it's Zach's House on Ellery.com. If you want to look up, it's .org or .com. I don't know. But Zach's House on Ellery, and it shows pictures of the house. And there's 9 beds there. And the
Hmm.
idea is that we developed this house to where the goal is that after a few months, we'll always have 50% of the people there that are in long-term sobriety, which we count as 6 months or longer. 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. So
Hmm.
that new ladies coming in will have a built-in mentorship of people that are there already, and they'll get that kind of support that they need. It's been just such a joy to be able to have this. And of course, this is opening up some roads. I mean, we don't want to stop there. The idea is but like anything else, there's competition for things.
Hmm.
But that's why I think we're always looking for that area where there is the most need and the least amount of connection. And then if we can
Hmm.
provide that, then we
Yeah.
feel like we're doing what we need to do. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, my experience with Sam was, and this is what I had heard and read, was that they need at least 18 months for their brains to
Sure.
start to heal and come back and so on and so forth. And so then it's just inconceivable that you would do 28 days and then kind of wrap it up and go home, because brains need to heal. Then
Right.
you have these habits of thinking and habits of emotions and habits of behavior that are really, it's a wiring of our brains in order to support recovery. We have to be rewired for recovery. And so to have a place to go to that is a sober living place to go for women in particular to continue their recovery process is, thank you for doing that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no,
Mhm.
it's great. We're so excited. We're also starting, hopefully within the next month, we're going to be creating a series of classes, a curriculum
Mhm.
that will be open to all sober living, anyone that's involved in sober living.
Mhm.
And we'll run a cycle, and I don't have it all worked out yet, but it's developing quite nicely. There'll be anywhere from 4 to 8 classes that'll run on a cycle, and they're just life skills classes.
Mhm.
Because the Lord knows what I
Mhm.
see happening is
Mhm.
that while people are in outpatient and an inpatient, they're going to a meeting every day. So 90
Right.
meetings in 90 days, and they hear the same stories, they hear the
Mhm.
same war stories. Now, is that important for someone newly in sobriety to know that they can make it? Absolutely it is, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But if you're getting ready to leave sober living and you've been on the street for 7 years and you still don't know how to menu plan,
Right.
you don't know how to do a budget,
Mhm.
or you don't know how to fill out an application for a job, it's not offering you all the help I think that you need. So, I mean, having just those
Right.
basic life skills that
Yeah.
many people get passed over on, right?
Right.
And part of
Yeah.
that too is this is my chance to be the dad again, right?
Yeah.
And set up that
Yeah.
stuff that I would have loved for Zach to have known,
Yeah.
that I poured into him and I wanted him to know, right? So,
Right. Right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm excited about that. And now I may teach one of the classes, but I'm getting different people from the community that will do this. They'll come in and we'll share this vital information. And again, it'll be open to everybody in sober living. And hopefully they'll make some different connections in there because there'll be different people there than they usually see at their meeting. And again,
Right.
I think that connection is what's so important.
Well, it's mission critical. I mean, the communities that we're able to build is 95% of our success.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing through all the work that you've done in the last 5 years and more is you're weaving community constantly, all these different things that you're doing in a community your size in Fresno, that is incredibly powerful. And so I love just to watch and talk to you about the evolution of community building. That's what you're doing. And you just keep expanding how you are connecting people and making Fresno a vibrant, support, networked web of connections that supports Fresno in becoming a place of community that is really about heartfelt community.
Hmm.
So you're changing the fabric of your community in so many ways, Jim.
Wow. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's the dream.
Well, I'm watching it happen. So, I mean, the next year and the next year and the next year, you're just evolving here. And you have that spirit of connection that's going to take many more forms from here on out, too. So, as we wrap this up, what's one thing that you've learned in the last few years that you didn't know?
Sure. And this is so critical. And it's something that I close out all of my sessions with, whether I'm talking to 100 high schoolers, I'm talking to 80-year-olds in a Kiwanis meeting, or church groups. After we've had a chance to share, like we've shared today, I like to ask people if their thoughts about what addiction can look like, what substance use disorder can feel like, if it has changed at all, if it's sparked even any kind of a question, or
Mhm.
has moved them to have a conversation with someone they know. Because I know that if I had been having conversations about Zach before he passed, it would have gave me the opportunity to have talked and to gather knowledge and to have maybe made a difference. I remember the day of his celebration of life, over 350 people there, walking through the line without exception. Every single one of them that shook my hand had a story of how addiction had affected their life. And all of those people that I
Mhm.
had known for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, not a single one of them had ever said a single word to me before that day about it.
Wow. Wow. Mm.
That's what needs to change.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the one thing.
Yeah. Yes. And you're doing it. You're doing it. And so, for whoever's listening today, please, please, please find a gym in your community. Find someone that can be that thread, that person, because you have no idea how many other parents, how many other siblings, how many other spouses. There are so many of us. We just need to have the courage to share. And then you're going to find out how many more thousands, millions of people are in this same position.
Right.
You are never, ever, ever alone.
That's true.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Jim, I don't, gratitude seems like there's not enough gratitude in the world for you for the journey that you're on. And yeah, so I am so deeply honored to be in your circle and to have been touched by your life and your work. And I'm a huge fan. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
So for those of you who want to reach out to him, go to Zachary Horton Foundation, Jim Horton, and reach out. Start the web of connection. Even if he's not in your community, start there, start somewhere, because we can connect more people up.
Yes.
Okay. So love each other, love yourselves. See you next month.